Hi Year 9 and welcome to our final lesson of this geographical investigation unit. We are looking at conclusions and evaluations today of our entire project. Now, this is the last 2 pages of your booklet, 16 and 17. And if you haven't completed any other part of your work, from the hypotheses at the beginning, the investigation process, the articles that we looked at to gain more information, from your secondary data analysis and primary data graphs and charts, the peel explanations of those. If there's any of that missing, you do need to make sure that you go back and finish it before the beginning of next week, okay? Or before the end of this week. Your teachers will be checking, phone calls will be made home. Please, please, please use the time to catch up on anything that you haven't done yet. So let's crack on with it. Conclusions and evaluations today. End of our investigation, we need to actually go back to the beginning. Right at the start in our first lesson, we talked about hypotheses, and those hypotheses were sort of statements that fit our investigation questions, the topics that we're investigating, and they said what we predicted would be the outcome. So you would have decided Preston Manor was as diverse as Brent or less diverse than Brent. And now at the end of the investigation, what we're looking to do is, based on our evidence, we want to see whether or not our hypothesis was correct or not. There's no judgment over whether or not your hypothesis was correct or not. We just want to make sure that we're using lots of evidence to prove or disprove it either way, okay? And it is totally valid for us to say, we were kind of right. So, just before we get started, on page 16 of your booklet, you need to make sure that you have filled in the diversity data for Preston Manor. Otherwise, the analysis that came with it at the end of last lesson, okay, and the conclusions that we write today won't be very solid. They won't have any evidence behind them. So it was this little bottom table here that you needed to copy out, okay, and it goes in to that diversity data, and that will allow us to compare it to Brent's diversity data. So right at the beginning of the investigation, we looked at this, and we have gone now all the way around our circle. We've done our introductions, we've done our methods, we've presented our data in graphs and charts, we've analysed our data, and today we're looking at doing conclusions, so creating a geographical argument to interpret our evidence, and our evaluation to look back at our methods and say, well, there's some issues here maybe. So, how do we write geographic conclusions? Okay, we're going to start with step 1, looking back at the original question or hypothesis, okay? And we're reviewing what we found out over the course of this investigation. It might be that some of the results we got were surprising to us, or maybe even we see the results and we think, those aren't right. That can't possibly be true. Let's take, for example, the fact that we seemed to find that we don't have any students or very few students from the Caribbean. But if we look at our school population, we know that we have lots of students from the Caribbean. So when we get to that point, when we're starting to question our data, that's evaluation. So we're going to leave that to the end of the lesson. Looking back at our evidence, then we're going to select our most important evidence. We can't use everything that we've collected, but we can use specific points that help to link to our hypothesis. We're going to look back at any theories or concepts that helped us with our original question, and then we're going to decide, okay, we've got a conclusion. We were either right or we were wrong. Are we confident that we are really, really right? Or do we think there were maybe some problems with our data, or maybe we're not quite enough evidence to prove this right or wrong? Okay. So back to our hypothesis. We started our investigations with this. We're going to end our investigations with this. Investigation question 1 was, is Preston Manor as diverse as the London Borough of Brent? And you would have chosen one of these 3 hypotheses and highlighted it. Okay, you would have also told me at the time why you chose that hypothesis. You either thought we were going to be more diverse than Brent or less diverse than Brent. And we had those articles, didn't we, at the very beginning that told us a little bit about Brent's background as a diverse place, amongst one of the most diverse places in the UK. So looking back at the hypothesis that you chose, do you think it was correct? What evidence do we have to support the statement? Well, let's have a think. Assuming that you chose Preston Manor is as diverse as the London Borough of Brent, And then we look at our results. We see that although we are very diverse at Preston Manor, we have many, many different communities from around the world represented, we don't necessarily have the same mixture of diversity. Let's have a look at those graphs. Collected in relation to Brent's diversity and Preston Manor's diversity. Our Brent diversity data was this stuff up here, okay? It came from a secondary source, which is a report on diversity published by Brent Council, and this is our calculated data from secondary data, or calculated information from secondary data from our student information management system. And so, although we do represent almost all the same places as Brent, with a notable exception of Oceania, we don't represent them in the same proportions. So, dependent on the hypothesis that you chose, you need to write your analysis and your conclusion based on that. If you had said, for example, that Brent was going to be less diverse than Preston Manor, or Preston Manor was going to be more diverse than Brent, then you need to say that your conclusion was either right or wrong or partially so, okay? If you wanted a reminder of all of the different places that we do represent at Preston Manor, they are up here in these two graphs. These are graphs of the same information, but presented in different ways. Let's look at our second investigation question now then. Our second investigation question then was about the impact of migration and diversity on Preston Manor School. Now, this question is very much about perception, okay? We measured it using a questionnaire of students and staff and some parents to see what people felt or thought was the impact of diversity on Preston Manor. And here we could have said either that there was going to be a positive impact, negative impact, or to have no impact whatsoever. Okay, now looking back at your opinion at the beginning of this, when you chose your hypothesis, do you think that that's still the case? Do we have evidence from our questionnaire that helps to support an argument to say that we have had a positive impact? Do you think that your evidence from the questionnaire shows that we've had a negative impact by having high levels of diversity? You might even want to go as deep as talking about the type of response that people gave. Sample data again, this was the fourth question in our questionnaire, and overwhelmingly respondents say that they feel that high diversity has a positive impact on Preston Manor School, and you can use the figures in this graph in your conclusion, okay? So if you had said that there was going to be a positive impact of diversity on Preston Manor in your hypothesis, you're going to say, I've proved my hypothesis correct, and here is the evidence to support that. If you maybe said that it had no impact or it had a negative impact, then you're going to write about the fact that your hypothesis appears to have been proven wrong, but not completely. People did say that some people did say there has been a negative impact, some people did say there was no impact. If we wanted to look at this in more detail, and we do want to look at this in more detail, we're starting to say what are the kinds of positives and negatives that are mentioned. Although not many people think that overall there is a negative impact, there's an overwhelming segment, 40.8% of respondents felt that the most negative impact of high diversity on Preston Manor was that people are quick to stereotype others. And even though people don't feel like overall there are negatives, this is clearly a significant negative of our diversity. Perhaps also you want to mention the fact that non-English speakers feel isolated, or that people don't take racist comments seriously enough, all things that have been raised as amongst the most significant negative impacts of diversity. When we look at the positive impacts of diversity on Preston Manor, in people's opinions are much more split. Some people feel it is mixed friendship groups, others feel it's about learning about other cultures, and even more people say that it's about the school promoting equality and having increased tolerance for each other. Okay? Giving examples like this, along with the figures in your conclusions, makes your conclusions more robust. It supports what you're saying. So that's the kind of thing that I'm expecting you to write for me, please, on page 16. So let's look at an example. Now, if you look carefully at this example, you will notice it has absolutely nothing to do with diversity at Preston Manor. This is an example about a river. It's a river's investigation, because geographical investigations and the skills that we've been learning here are not just applicable to thinking about diversity, not just thinking about our own school, but also to the wider environment. We can do both human and physical investigations in geography. And this example, this model answer for a conclusion, is from a physical investigation. What you should be able to see here is that there's a little bit of structure that says this hypothesis was, when you talk about your hypothesis, the data that I collected showed that it increased or decreased, or it was proved right or it was proved wrong because of, okay? And you can see if you read through these that there's evidence in here, there's examples, okay? There's phrases like generally, where we don't have all of the answers fitting what we're suggesting, but many of them, okay? And then an exception. So generally this, the exception, however, but that, okay? And this is the way that I would like your conclusions to be written out. Our evaluation is much as it is for a science investigation. We are looking back at what we've done and identifying where we could have improved it. What maybe was quite a positive way of collecting data or finding information. Are there things that we could have done to improve that? And are there any issues with our results as a result of things that we did or the types of information that we collected that perhaps we don't trust? What we're saying here is that not all of our results might be reliable. So, there are 3 questions for you to answer relatively briefly here. And the first question is about our data collection methods. We had 2 methods of data collection. One was primary data through our questionnaire. And you may have noticed that the questions themselves you didn't write. You didn't choose those questions. If you could add any question to the questionnaire, what would you have asked to help us with this investigation? Okay. Perhaps you noticed that we didn't really use data from one of the questions, the question about whether or not respondents felt British. Is that because it didn't link clearly enough with our investigation purpose, our hypothesis? Or is that because we didn't make a clear enough link to the outcome of that data with some of the other results that we found? Second, what issue is there with the secondary data on pupils' country of origin? Well, I've mentioned this to you quite a few times. When we look at our pupil country of origin data, it appears that we have relatively few people from the Caribbean, but this is not necessarily true. Here's the question: why does it seem in our student data as if people are not from the Caribbean when their heritage is? What could have resulted in this false outcome? Well, if you haven't worked it out by now, the reason that this happens is when students sign up to school, many of us have British passports. And with our British passport, the temptation is to just put your origin down as British. A lot of people don't choose to put down that their family is from the Caribbean, even though in fact it will have been back maybe their parents, their grandparents, or their great-grandparents who came from the Caribbean. They may personally identify as still being Caribbean as opposed to British, or maybe they have a dual identity, a mixed identity, where they feel both Caribbean and British. But this problem exists because of where we got the data from and the way in which people fill out these types of data sources. When you fill out a form, if your passport says you're British, you put down that you're British. Often we don't think what we're being asked about is how we feel in terms of our identity. And finally then, what bias is there in this whole investigation that might have influenced your conclusions? Now, you can come up with any bias that you can think of, but if you need a bit of a prompt, you might want to think about where we started this investigation. We're talking about our local area, Brent, and our school, both of which are highly diverse. would this investigation have been as interesting or turned out very different results if we were maybe a school in the northeast of England? Would we have something equally interesting to find out, or would we have had to change the way that we completed this investigation in order to do that? Okay, so when your work is complete, please make sure that you submit it on Google Classroom. For those of you that have participated fully in this project, I'm really, really pleased. Thank you very, very much for all your hard work. I hope that it has served as an interesting taster of the type of work that we're going to be doing in GCSE Geography. Now, we're moving on to doing video lessons for Year 10, but if you've got the channel, you can subscribe and you'll still be able to access all of that in advance of starting your GCSE course. Bye guys.